welcome to this deep dive. It is so great to have you with us today.
Yeah, really glad to be here.
Whether you are brushing up on your history for a class, prepping for a big meeting, or you are just, one of those insanely curious people who loves to understand how global geopolitics actually tick beneath the surface, you are in the exact right place.
Absolutely.
Today, we have a massive, truly global topic. We're diving into an extensive, incredibly detailed stack of historical data and comprehensive Wikipedia records covering the Allies of World War I.
And it really is an enormous amount of material.
It is. And our mission for you today is to give you the ultimate shortcut to understanding this colossal conflict, but doing it without leaving you feeling overwhelmed by just a dry list of dates and treaties.
That is the goal. Because when you look at the sheer scale of the First World War, it is incredibly easy to get lost in the volume of information. The historical records we are working from today are dense.
Very dense.
We are talking about demographics, industrial economics, secret treaties, global troop movements. But we are not here to just recite a timeline at you. We want to synthesize all of this so you walk away with a real, firm understanding of the underlying forces that were actually at play.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because the story I always had in my head, and I think the story a lot of us get, is a very simple good guys versus bad guys narrative.
Yeah, a heroic team-up.
Exactly. But looking at the notes you pulled together, it reveals something completely different. We are going to look beyond that simplistic view to understand the surprising and frankly sometimes completely contradictory motivations that actually glue the Entente powers together.
Yeah, to understand the Allies, or the Entente, we really have to establish a baseline of what Europe looked like before the powder keg went off.
Before 1914.
Right. Before the summer of 1914, Europe was largely split into two major power blocs. You had the Triple Entente, which was made up of the United Kingdom, France, and Russia. And on the other side, you had the Triple Alliance, originally composed of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. But as we are going to see, these alliances were incredibly fluid.
They weren't set in stone.
They were practically written in pencil.
I always thought Britain jumped in simply to back up France against Germany. But the research highlights this wild detail about how their entry was actually triggered by something way older.
It was.
Because for much of the 19th century, Britain had this policy called splendid isolation.
Right, they wanted to stay out of it.
They essentially wanted to maintain the balance of power in Europe from afar without getting dragged into messy formal alliances.
Yeah.
So how did that isolation actually fall apart?
It fell apart because of a legal commitment made decades earlier. Britain joined the war largely because of the 1839 Treaty of London.
Wow.
Specifically, Article 7 of that treaty guaranteed Belgian neutrality, and it committed Britain to defend that neutrality by force if necessary.
Wait, 1839, so they went to war in 1914 over a piece of paper signed 75 years earlier.
They did. And that brings us to Germany's catastrophic miscalculation. Germany had a nightmare scenario fighting a two-front war against Russia in the east and France in the west.
So they needed a fast solution.
To avoid this, they devised a strategy.
Is that the Schlieffen Plan? I saw that term in the notes. For those of us who haven't sat in a European history classroom in a while, what exactly was the Schlieffen Plan?
Simply put, the Schlieffen Plan was Germany's ticking clock strategy to knock France out of the war rapidly before the massive Russian army could fully mobilize.
I see.
But to get to Paris quickly, the German army had to march through neutral Belgium. When they did that in August 1914, they blatantly violated that 1839 treaty.
The one Britain signed.
Exactly. The German chancellor at the time, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, famously dismissed this binding international law as a mere scrap of paper.
A scrap of paper?
Yes, he genuinely could not believe the British Empire would go to war over it.
It is wild to think about a head of state saying that out loud, completely dismissing the foundational rules of international diplomacy.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this shows just how fatal underestimating the rule of international law can be. Germany assumed Britain would stay out.
They misread the room completely.
Completely. They expected a short war and believed that domestic troubles, specifically the brewing crisis in Ireland, would keep the British completely distracted.
But it didn't.
No. Violating that treaty presented the British government with a stark moral and strategic choice. That so-called scrap of paper brought the entire British Empire into the conflict.
And that empire was huge.
At the time, that empire had a population of over 446 million subjects.
446 million people mobilized over a border violation. That changes the scale of the war instantly.
It really does.
Now, crossing the English Channel, France's motivation seems entirely different. The data points to this concept of revanchism, which literally translates to revenge.
Revenge was a massive cultural driver for France. They were still stinging from their humiliating defeat in the 1870 Franco-Prussian War, where they lost the heavily industrialized provinces of Alsace-Lorraine.
And that loss was a big deal, right?
It didn't just hurt their pride, it deprived them of their natural geographic defense line on the Rhine River.
And reading through the demographics from the time, it wasn't just about lost land. There was a genuine existential panic happening in France, wasn't there?
A profound demographic panic. By 1911, Germany's population was booming, sitting at nearly 65 million. France, meanwhile, had stagnated at under 40 million.
Oh, wow, that is a huge gap.
They had the lowest birth rate in Europe. The French military command knew they were at a severe, perhaps insurmountable numerical disadvantage.
So they needed help.
Exactly. This terror of simply being outpopulated is why a democratic republic like France desperately cultivated an alliance with the autocratic Russian Empire. They needed Russian bodies to balance the scales.
The cost of that numerical disadvantage was horrific. The historical data gives a staggering, tragic statistic that I had to read twice.
The casualties were immense.
Just between August and December of 1914, the very first months of the conflict, France lost nearly 300,000 dead on the Western Front.
Think about that for a second.
It is hard to even picture. That is more dead in a few months than Britain suffered in the entirety of the Second World War.
Yeah.
It is incredibly grim.
It is a staggering human cost, and it perfectly explains why France was utterly reliant on its allies to keep fighting.
Which naturally brings us to Russia.
Right. Now, Russia's entry into the war is often framed around their self-appointed role as the grand defender of the Slavs.
Because of Serbia.
Yes. When Austria-Hungary threatened Serbia after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Russia mobilized to protect their fellow Slavic people.
But the research reveals there was a deeply strategic, long-held motive operating just under the surface, right? It wasn't just about cultural solidarity.
Far from it. Russia had a long-standing, relentless objective to gain control of the Bosporus Straits.
The geographic choke point.
If you look at a map, the Russian Empire was massive, but it lacked reliable, year-round access to the global oceans. Gaining the Bosporus would give their Black Sea fleet a warm water route into the Mediterranean Sea.
Which was heavily dominated by the British at the time.
Exactly. It is like owning a massive mansion but not having the keys to the front door. Russia needed that maritime choke point.
That makes perfect sense.
So when you look at the big three of the Entente, you have Britain fighting to uphold a treaty and global balance, France fighting for literal survival and territorial revenge, and Russia fighting for ethnic solidarity but also pushing for a critical geographic prize.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the Allies weren't just this static group of three. The alliances shifted in ways that feel like a political thriller today.
They really did.
Let's look at Italy.
Yeah.
Going into 1914, Italy was formally allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary. They were part of the Triple Alliance.
Yeah, right.
So how on earth do they end up fighting on the complete opposite side?
It is one of the most fascinating geopolitical flips of the era. When hostilities broke out, Italy essentially hit pause.
They just waited.
They declared neutrality, arguing that the Triple Alliance was strictly defensive. Since Austria-Hungary was the aggressor making demands on Serbia, Italy claimed they weren't legally obligated to join the fight.
A convenient loophole.
Very convenient. But the underlying reality was entirely economic.
What blew my mind in the research was the detail about their resource dependency. It literally came down to coal.
You cannot fight an industrialized war without coal. It powered the trains, the dreadnoughts, the factories, and Italy imported 90% of its coal from the United Kingdom and France.
So Britain and France basically held the keys to Italy's survival.
They controlled the very raw materials Italy needed to keep the lights on. Furthermore, Italian nationalists desperately wanted to annex territories like Trieste and Trento,
which were held by Austria-Hungary.
The problem was, those territories were controlled by Austria-Hungary, their supposed ally.
The Italian prime minister at the time, Antonio Salandra, actually coined a phrase for this cautious, calculating approach.
Sacred egoism.
Yes, he called it sacred egoism, which has to be the most incredibly honest way for a politician to say, we're going to do whatever serves our own interests.
It really is.
And what served them best was secretly signing the 1915 Treaty of London with the Entente. promising them those Austrian territories in exchange for turning their guns on their former allies.
It was a highly calculated, highly transactional alliance. And speaking of calculated maneuvers, we have to look at Japan.
Yes, Japan's role is wild.
Most people today, when they think of global conflicts, instantly associate Japan with the Axis powers of World War II. But in World War I, Japan was a vital Entente ally.
Completely vital. And they used an existing treaty, the 1902 Anglo-Japanese Alliance, to aggressively pursue their own regional dominance.
They saw an opening.
When Britain asked for help hunting down German naval units in Chinese waters, Japan saw a massive opportunity. They declared war on Germany and proceeded to systematically seize German colonies across the Pacific.
The Mariana, Caroline, and Marshall Islands.
Exactly. And they laid siege to the German port of Qingdao in China.
What's fascinating here is the statistical disparity of Japan's involvement. The historical record provides a complete breakdown of mobilized personnel versus casualties.
Right.
Out of roughly 800,000 mobilized Japanese personnel, they suffered exactly 415 military fatalities.
Wait, hold on. They mobilized 800,000 people, but only lost 415. How is that even possible in a war known for its absolute meat grinder casualties?
Because they fought a highly localized, largely naval and siege-based campaign against isolated German garrisons that had no hope of reinforcement.
Oh, I see.
It resulted in a casualty rate of around 0.05%. It is the lowest of any of the major powers by a massive margin.
Unbelievable.
Yet, despite risking very little manpower, Japan used the distraction of the war in Europe to issue the 21 demands to China. They demanded extensive economic and political concessions, and they gained massive territorial leverage in the Pacific.
An incredibly high return on a very low investment of human life. But that aggressive expansion actually started to worry the other allies.
It certainly did.
By the time the United States entered the war, they were already viewing Japan more as a potential Pacific threat than a trusted partner. Which brings us to the U.S.
A very late arrival.
The United States didn't enter until April 1917, and even then, they refused to call themselves an ally.
That is a crucial distinction. The U.S. entered as an associated power. This was a deliberate, very careful diplomatic choice by President Woodrow Wilson.
Why did he do that?
He wanted to avoid what George Washington had famously warned against foreign entanglements. The U.S. wanted to help defeat Germany, but they absolutely did not want to be bound by the secret treaties and territorial promises that the British, French, and Italians had been making to each other behind closed doors.
And for anyone wondering what finally pushed the U.S. out of isolationism, it wasn't just sympathy. It was Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare.
Sinking ships without warning.
Meaning their U-boats were sinking American merchant and passenger ships without warning. That combined with the infamous Zimmermann telegram.
For those unfamiliar, the Zimmermann telegram was a secret diplomatic communication where Germany actually proposed an alliance with Mexico.
Just a crazy plan.
They suggested that if the U.S. entered the war, Mexico should attack America to recover territories like Texas and Arizona. When British intelligence intercepted that and handed it to the Americans, public outrage made war inevitable.
This raises an important question, though.
Go ahead.
When we talk about Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Japan, and the U.S., we're talking about the men in capital cities making the strategic decisions. But who actually did the bleeding?
Right.
If you look at the raw data, it becomes glaringly obvious that this wasn't just a European war fought by Europeans.
This raises an important question: who actually did the fighting? It wasn't just Europeans, not even close. Because these were vast empires, a declaration of war in London or Paris echoed immediately across the globe.
It pulled everyone in.
Let's look at the British Empire. The British Indian Army mobilized 1.4 million soldiers. We are talking about over 1 million men from modern-day India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, fighting in the trenches of France and the deserts of the Middle East.
And logistics won the First World War just as much as artillery did. The historical records highlight the incredibly overlooked contribution of the Belgian Congo.
Yes, the numbers there are intense.
They provided 25,000 troops, but more astonishingly, an estimated 260,000 porters joined the British forces in the East African campaign.
We really need to pause on that number. 260,000 porters.
That's a massive labor force.
In the East African campaign, the jungle terrain and diseases like sleeping sickness meant horses and mules simply died. So the physical labor of the war carrying heavy ammunition, food, and artillery shells through dense brush for hundreds of miles was carried entirely on the backs of human beings.
Wow.
Largely colonial subjects who suffered terrible mortality rates from disease and exhaustion.
France operated similarly, didn't they? Because of that demographic weakness we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
The panic over their low birth rate.
Yes. France relied heavily on African colonial recruits. Over 500,000 colonial troops from places like Senegal and Algeria served on the Western Front, trying to plug the massive gaps left by the horrifying European casualty rates.
And while we are discussing horrifying casualties, we have to highlight the tragic irony of Serbia.
Serbia's story is devastating.
The entire mechanism of the war was triggered by the July crisis over Serbia. They successfully repulsed the initial Austro-Hungarian invasion in 1914, which was a massive upset.
But it couldn't last.
No, they were eventually overwhelmed by a combined multi-front invasion from German, Austrian, and Bulgarian armies.
The numbers for Serbia are just heartbreaking. Between 1914 and 1918, Serbia suffered the greatest proportional losses of any combatant in the entire war.
Over 1.2 million dead.
Yes. That was nearly 30% of their entire population.
Nearly 1 in 3 people. The sheer scale of that devastation is almost impossible to comprehend today.
It underscores a harsh reality of this conflict. While the major imperial powers debated grand strategy in London and Paris, the small affiliated states often bore the most intense, concentrated destruction.
Since we are looking at those affiliated states, the data is packed with amazing stories about the smaller nations that jumped into the fray. I want to spend a moment on Romania, because their contribution was incredibly unique.
Romania is a fascinating case study in making the most of limited resources. They entered the war in 1916 on the Allied side, and they ended up fighting on the longest front in Europe.
Stretching 1,600 kilometers.
But what really stands out is their technological ingenuity.
The historical records note that they built the Vlachud III, which was the world's first aircraft made of metal, and they didn't stop there.
No, they got really creative with artillery.
Facing a massive shortage of modern artillery, they took old, obsolete fortification guns and naval cannons and mounted them on locally built carriages. They actually managed to create what was considered the most effective field howitzer in Europe at the time.
It is a brilliant example of a smaller power innovating under extreme pressure to punch well above its weight class against industrialized empires.
Then you have Greece, where the political situation was basically a geopolitical soap opera. The historical texts describe it as a national schism.
It quite literally tore the country's leadership apart. You had King Constantine, who was educated in Prussia and was actually married to the German emperor's sister.
Naturally, he was firmly pro-German.
Yes, and he believed the Central Powers would win the war. But his prime minister, Eleftherios Venizelos, who was wildly popular with the public and had won multiple elections, was strictly pro-Entente.
So you have the king pulling the military one way, the prime minister pulling the government the other.
Complete paralysis.
It got so bad that at one point, there were literally 2 separate governments operating in Greece at the exact same time, a royalist one in Athens and an Entente-backed one in Crete.
It wasn't until the king was eventually forced into exile in 1917 by the Allies that Greece fully committed to the war effort.
And we cannot talk about a world war without mentioning South America. Brazil is the only South American country to actively participate in the conflict.
That's a great point to bring in.
They joined in 1917, and interestingly, they cited the exact same reasons as the U.S. Germany's U-boats sinking their merchant ships in the Atlantic. And they didn't just declare war on paper to look supportive.
They actually sent forces.
They actually sent a naval division to operate alongside the British fleet. They deployed military aviators to the Western Front, and they sent a massive medical mission of surgeons and nurses to staff the field hospitals in Europe.
A very real contribution.
So what does this all mean? When we step back and look at the Allies based on everything we've unpacked today, it becomes crystal clear that they were not some unified, morally simplistic superhero team fighting for a single righteous cause.
They were a remarkably messy, incredibly fragile coalition. You had global empires fighting to maintain their maritime dominance, nations fighting for sheer demographic survival, leaders driven by decades-old historical grudges, and countries forced into alliances based on pure, unavoidable resource dependency.
Like Italy's desperate need for coal.
Exactly.
It's honestly a miracle they held together long enough to actually win the war.
And that is the crucial takeaway for you listening right now.
Yeah.
When you look at modern geopolitical alliances today, when you read the international news or see new treaties being signed in capital cities, remember this deep dive.
The history informs the present.
Every international treaty, every grand alliance is backed by incredibly complex, often hidden domestic realities. The headlines might say one thing about shared values, but beneath the surface, there is almost always a demographic anxiety like France had, or a resource dependency like Italy's. History doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes.
That is perfectly said. It changes how you read the news, knowing that there is always a coal factor hidden somewhere in the fine print.
Always.
Before we go, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over on your own. Toward the very end of our research materials, there's a small section detailing non-state combatants. It lists the Armenian, Assyrian, Polish, and Czechoslovak legions.
Think about what that actually means in practice.
Exactly. These were volunteer forces fighting viciously alongside the Allies, but their own homelands were currently controlled by the enemy powers.
They had no country of their own yet.
Imagine the sheer willpower it must have taken to endure the mud, the poison gas, and the absolute horrors of trench warfare, fighting on behalf of someone else's empire.
It's staggering.
They were bleeding in the desperate hope that an Allied victory might somehow, miraculously, birth a country for them that didn't even exist on a map yet. Imagine the world those surviving veterans stepped into when the maps of Europe and the Middle East were entirely redrawn in 1919.
Such a powerful perspective.
It is a heavy, incredible thought to end on. We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources today. We hope you learned something new, and we wish you a great rest of your day.